Great. So I am taking Luann at her word and speaking a little less formally, perhaps, more of a reflection on some of the work that I've been doing. But I also very much want to thank Luann and Jennifer for the invitation to participate in this series. There's a lot of really great work going on migration. Next week or soon, Michael, other people are going to be speaking, and it's really a pleasure to be up here and also share the panel with my colleagues. So migration, to me, is really interesting for a number of reasons. I'm really intrigued by the ways in which migration, this movement of people across jurisdictions, in one way or another, moving around, ends up disrupting what's going on the ground and how we see and understand a whole range of things, disrupting the equation between presence and citizenship, between presence and rights, questions around identity, things that you tend to think fit into one coherent package end up being disturbed a little bit in the process of migration. And this is the case not only for people who move, but also for people who stay, and also for people in places where people move to. And so that ends up, providing a point of entry for looking at all sorts of really interesting processes in my mind, and presumably in others. And so today, and obviously these are some of the reasons why migration matters. We've heard about some of these issues around rights, rights that people maybe don't have because they've come from another jurisdiction, right? And the roles that states, extraterritorial powers that states may try to engage in pursuit of regulating the activities of their emigrants, remitters. So I want to talk today about some of the work that I've been doing in this area. Much of this work is collaborative work with Patricia Landolt at the U of T. And so some of these ideas have come up in our joint work, and also in work with other colleagues. I think I don't have to say too much about the context that we're all running around in. When I say that I'm working on issues of precarious status and precarious work in the Canadian context, we know that there are transformations in citizenship and immigration policy that involve a huge increase in the number of temporary residents that are entering Canada, but also the number of temporary residents who are present in Canada at any given point in time. And that's temporary workers, international students, humanitarian, refugee claimants. There are a number of different categories. It's not just the numbers coming in, it's also those still present who entered in some other time. And a number of people have drawn attention to this. So this raises questions about a growing population of people with precarious legal status who are present. And it's not just a question of what's happening with them, but also interactions between them and employers, and Geraldina Polanco's work speaks to some of this. Also, what's going on in terms of social inequality in Canada more generally. There are also changes in labor markets. Leah Vasco's work, other people's work, have pointed to these dramatic transformations in labor markets, so that job precarity is becoming more of an issue for more people, right? This is not a low-wage worker problem. This is a growing problem, and that is part of the changing context. So some years ago, let me just, before I go into our work, I feel like at this point, the whole notion of precarious legal status has been thrown around quite a bit, but it's come to mean maybe different things in people's minds. I think some people equate it with undocumented, and I just want to clarify that that's not what I mean. Illegalization and being without status is a part of precarious status, but in my approach, precarious legal status includes various forms. And it can really be distinguished by, whoops, well, the formatting got a little disrupted there. But if any of the following kinds of issues are present, if there is only temporary residence authorization, if there is only temporary work authorization, if people depend on a third party for their presence, whether that's an employer and the job, the work permit, or a sponsoring spouse or a partner, not being able to access or having very limited access to so-called public services, so you're really formally and perhaps informally not part of the public, in the public. Can't sponsor relatives, and of course deportability, which is a big one, sort of trumps other issues. But any one of these, so that this means that in our approach, precarious legal status includes authorized as well as unauthorized categories. International students, temporary workers, refugee claimants, right? As well as people who don't have papers. So sorry to kind of beat that into the ground, but the term gets thrown around and I want to be specific about how we're using it. I think for precarious work, I don't have to go into that very much, but it's clearly a multidimensional concept that is, as Leah Vasco and her colleagues and others have discussed, it's not only about non-standard work, atypical work, part-time work, but it also has to do with questions of control over the work process, the insecurity, the unpredictability of work and the employment relationship. So just in terms of terms. So sometime back now, Patricia Landolt and I got some SSHRC funding, and we did a survey with a research team, and we interviewed 300 Latin American and Caribbean-born respondents, people who participated in the survey. And the reason we went to all the time and trouble of doing this is that we could not find an existing database that would give us the information that we wanted. So yes, it took a little bit of time. You can see more about the survey on the website, but this is something about the criteria for being in the sample. And just to give you a little bit of a summary of findings, we were framing things. Let me back up a sec. We were interested in understanding the determinants of precarious employment among immigrants, particularly among more recent immigrants. And we were doing this in a way that included closed questions and open-ended questions in this survey, in this face-to-face survey. So we looked at some of the usual things like education, time in Canada, things like that. But we also gathered information on legal status on entry and legal status at the time of the survey. And we didn't explicitly go after trajectories, but we picked up some information along the way about trajectories of legal status. And that's a little bit of a footnote about reflections of, how one does one's research and how one doesn't plan everything very well ahead of time, or how one learns in the process of doing it. But we constructed a little variable for change in legal status, just looking at initial and current. And for your info, we had people who entered with secure status with permanent residence or citizenship, and people who remained in that situation, and that's the top row. We had people who entered in some kind of precarious status and remained in a precarious status, and that's the bottom row. And then we had a group of people, or some respondents, who entered in some kind of precarious status and moved to secure status by the time of the survey. And we used this as a variable in the quantitative analysis that we first did. And we found that this issue of change in legal status, and I'm using change to include what may sound like non-change, as in continuing in secure, or continuing in some form of precarious, right? Because it speaks to the trajectory over time. We found that this was really significant in predicting the quality of people's employment at the time of the survey. Things like education and time in Canada were not significant. Language, some institutional factors, language, some training on the job were significant. Early work quality, the job quality of people's work in their first year, not so surprisingly perhaps, was important, but this question of change in legal status was very significant. And, you know, in a way, maybe it shouldn't have surprised us, but in some ways it did. It did not surprise us that people who entered and stayed precarious had lower quality jobs. Their jobs were more precarious. But it did surprise us not to see more of a difference, not more of an improvement for people who had shifted to secure status. And so since doing that, and some of you may have heard me run through some of this, since then we've been trying to look at this question of why and to understand this more. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit more today. One of the points, and if you've looked at that co-edited book and our chapter in that book, you know that one of our arguments is that it really takes work of various sorts, work that takes time and work that takes resources to move through various legal status situations. You may enter as a temporary worker. You may enter as a refugee claimant. You may enter as an international student. And then if you're interested in staying on, you may need to renew a permit. I'm thinking of the costs of those ancillary services that were just described, you know, the whole issue of permits and renovations and medical exams. All this costs money. It all takes time, right? So people are trying to figure out ways to do things. That's a kind of work that is exhausting and takes time. And in the process, you run into people who may help or who may really hinder. You run into people who may facilitate or people who you end up losing lots of money to. You may end up more deportable. You also, in the process of being somebody who's here without the security, the relative security of secure status of permanent residence or citizenship, you may be vulnerable to wage theft, you may be vulnerable to lower wages, a series of things. So there are ways that you're losing money and time and resources and not being able to do other things that you might do to improve your situation, like on-the-job training, education, investing your time and resources in other ways. So there are ways in which we argue that the experience of spending time in precarious legal status situations really has long-term effects on people's job quality, but really that's just an indicator for a wider set of experiences. It just happens to be what we were able to measure in that particular way. But I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about some of the ways that this is helping us rethink the concepts and the frameworks that we're using as we continue with this work. And one has to do with talking about the chutes and ladders of immigration trajectories and work trajectories. Yeah, it looks like a bit of a jumble, right? But the point here is that rather than thinking about people entering Canada in a particular, through a particular doorway that's going to have some predictable linear progression that at some point has some version of integration or return home, that there are a set of nonlinear, not always predictable shifts and movements that may include spending some time without status, trying to put in an application maybe on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, or applying as an international student, something else, and shifting between categories. Now, as a bit of an aside, CIC and Stats Canada do give us information in the facts and figures on legal status transitions, but they give us information on one transition, and we don't know how these transitions play out over time. We also don't know how many people might have been able to transition at any given point in time. So in a way, I feel like looking at these trajectories that we hadn't really planned to do, but being able to look at these trajectories with the data that we do have, opens up a really interesting window on some ways in which migration and legal status and rights matter. Now, I want to say a few more things about the chutes and ladders. Do I have a few more minutes? Yes? Along the way, as I mentioned, people encounter different actors. They also, given the doors through which they come, they have access to different supports and services. So coming in as a secure immigrant, as an official recognized immigrant, offers some supports and services that one doesn't have if one is a temporary, precarious entrant. With the two-step, with the shifts in policy that are moving us towards more two-step migration or probationary migration, it's likely that people will be spending more time in some of these situations without regulatory protections, without access to various support services. So I think that raises questions about the kinds of immigrant experiences that Canadians, or Canadian society, Canadian government, is expecting, the kinds of outcomes that are being expected. There's a certain amount of vulnerability that's involved in this churning through precarious legal status situations. And I really want to emphasize the role of different actors interacting with newcomers of various sorts, official immigrants and also de facto immigrants, de facto residents. That has prompted us to elaborate a concept of the conditionality of presence and work. And it's a concept that's really aimed at helping us to think about the work that's involved. What are the conditions that have to be met to stick around? What is the agency involved in trying to find a way to patch together access to services, to rights, and so forth? What is really involved in trying to stay? How do different actors in various situations contribute to facilitating, hindering, whether it's an employer, whether it's a frontline service provider? People play different kinds of roles in facilitating presence, facilitating ongoing work, negotiating rights, maybe temporarily, sometimes in some of the collective organizing and collective action that takes place through some of the rights organizations, migrant rights organizations, like No One Is Illegal, others. Some of these negotiated access questions may become more visible, sort of have to see what happens. For example, I'm thinking of the City of Toronto Sanctuary City Initiative. You know, it's unclear what kinds of long-term consequences the agency that people exercise and the work that's being done by a number of institutional actors will have. But I think this gives us an interesting way of thinking about it and questioning some of the recent changes in policy. And I think it also leaves us with some things to think about in terms of thinking about how we research migration and incorporation or integration. Maybe not such a clear-cut linear path, and the importance of not just looking at people in a particular category, which is certainly very valuable, but thinking about people navigating through or potentially navigating through a series of categories and what's involved in those processes. Thank you.